For years, it was one of the West's greatest geostrategic nightmares. The emergence of the so-called Axis of Upheaval was meant to change everything. Comprising China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, this slowly coalescing bloc of anti-Western, authoritarian regimes spent much of the early 2020s growing ever closer. Spurred on by the war in Ukraine, their alignment, at least from the outside, seemed to signal a dangerous new force to rival the American-led order. But notice our hedging of the words there in that last segment seemed to signal, meant to change everything. Because the worry about the Axis of Upheaval was always that its component parts would back one another. That, with their presence in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, Tehran, Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang would be able to escalate any regional conflict into World War III. Well, now that regional conflict has happened. On the 13th of June, Israel launched audacious strikes on Iran's nuclear program and leadership. Days later, America joined the fray, directly bombing the Islamic Republic. And in the face of this unprovoked attack on one of their members, the Axis of Upheaval did nothing. As in, absolutely nothing. Sure, there was some stern words condemning the attacks, but other than that, Moscow, Beijing, and Pyongyang effectively just whistled and looked the other way as American and Israeli bombs devastated their close partner. Now, some watching this will already be raising objections. Hello there. After all, none of the three capitals had a mutual defense pact with Tehran. None of them were in a formal military alliance with the Islamic Republic. So aren't we overselling the concept of this axis somewhat? To which, well, we can only say, go look at the rhetoric that was coming from these capitals just months ago. Look at the ways Tehran was helping in their hours of need. Look, too, at the clear expectation on the Iranian side. And then tell us that the Ayatollah isn't right now angrily sticking pins into voodoo dolls of Putin, Xi, and Kim. Because, after all, it was only in January that Russia and Iran signaled a new strategic partnership amid much fanfare. A partnership that may not have included a mutual defense clause, but was clearly meant to signal a growing bond between the two nations. One that, when crunch time came, turned out to be as strong and eternal as two teenage girls earnestly swearing to be BFFs for life. The question we're going to try and answer today is, well, why? Why did Russia, China, and North Korea all fail to provide any meaningful assistance in Iran's hour of need? And to figure it out, we're going to tackle them one at a time. Starting with the country that signed the strategic partnership in January, Russia. From the Iranian perspective, you can see why Tehran might have hoped Moscow would step in on its behalf. Ever since Russian aircraft began bombing Syrian cities into rubble in 2015, the Kremlin and the Islamic Republic have been working together to expand their influence. Initially, their shared goal was to keep Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria. But once Russian armor rolled over the border into Ukraine, their partnership moved to a whole other level. With Moscow's forces today slowly grinding forwards in Donbass, it can be easy to forget just what a catastrophe the initial months of the invasion were for the Kremlin. Caught off guard by stiff Ukrainian resistance, Russia was reduced to begging its friends for help. Iran would be among the first to acquiesce. First turning up in summer of 2022, Iranian Shahed drones have since become a fixture of the war, causing death and destruction in cities across Ukraine. So useful have they been that the Kremlin has now started manufacturing them itself, turning out 2,700 Shaheds a month. But Tehran didn't just prop up the Kremlin's war effort with thousands of drones. The Islamic Republic also provided artillery ammunition and may even have sent ballistic missiles. Coming at Russia's greatest point of weakness in the war, these Iranian supplies were crucial. While we wouldn't go so far as to say that they were the only thing keeping Moscow in the fight, they absolutely didn't hurt, did they? Now look, none of these weapons came free, and Iran received good cash from a desperate Kremlin. Still, you can see why the Iranians might have expected some gratitude. As Iran researcher Manaz Sharali noted to ABC, quote, "Russia has never truly helped Iran. On the contrary, the Islamic Republic has helped Russia a great deal, providing them with missiles and drones." More to the point, if the so-called Axis of Upheaval really were the geopolitical bogeyman 1,000 think pieces made it out to be, we would have seen far greater cooperation between the two. Yet even before the war blew up with Israel, Russia was giving Iran the cold shoulder. Back in November 2023, Iran, likely sensing that war with Israel was coming, asked Moscow to supply it with everything from additional S-400 air defense systems to Mi-28 attack helicopters and Sukhoi Su-35 jet fighters. Nikita Smagin, an expert on Russia-Iran relations, told the New York Times what happened next, quoting him. Iran has been asking Russia for weapons for the last few years. It has been asking for aircraft. It has been asking for air defense systems. Russia has given practically nothing. End quote. Now, importantly, this included the period following Israel's destruction of Iran's pre-existing air defenses last year. As the Wall Street Journal notes, quoting, In the months that followed, Russia was either unable or unwilling to replace them. The journal also claims that the only jets Moscow ever supplied Tehran with were Yak-130 training jets. Reason? Diplomatic pressure from the Gulf states, which didn't want Iran buying anything more advanced. And it's here that we start to see the outlines of Russia's foreign policy regarding the Axis, the one that has doomed so many of the Kremlin's allies to disappointment. For all his talk about mutual interests, the reality is that Vladimir Putin's approach to alliances is purely transactional. Just look at some of the most prominent Russian allies who were left in the lurch in recent years. In 2023, Azerbaijan's forces overran the ethnically Armenian enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh despite the presence of Russian peacekeepers who Vladimir Putin had personally said would guarantee the safety of the Karabakhis. In skirmishes the year before, Azerbaijan shelled across the border into Armenia itself, yet Moscow took no action despite having a mutual defense treaty with Yerevan. In that case, the Kremlin tried to spin it as just rewards for Armenia flirting with the West. But Yerevan only started looking to France and America when it became clear that Russia couldn't or wouldn't defend it. Things were even more disappointing for Bashar al-Assad. When a coalition of rebel groups marched on Damascus in late 2024, Putin failed to intervene to save the ally he'd spent a decade propping up. As a result, Assad was overthrown. Just weeks later, in early 2025, the breakaway Moldovan region of Transnistria also got to experience similar feelings of abandonment when Moscow cut off their gas. Effectively a Russian client state since 1992, Transnistria's economy had been propped up by gigantic flows of free gas. But Gazprom stopped deliveries in January as a means to pressure Moldova. While Moldova suffered an energy shock, Transnistria almost collapsed. Since the cutoff, the statelet has been in a rolling state of emergency. With the events of the last few days, Iran then has become simply the latest Russian friend to discover the partnership was mostly one way. As far as we could tell, it's now been over 3 years since Moscow last successfully intervened to help an ally when the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization helped put down riots in Kazakhstan in early 2022. That date gives a pretty likely reason as to why the Kremlin's reach has been faltering of late. Since becoming bogged down in the Ukrainian quagmire, Russia has lacked the strength to handle any other crisis. From being able to simultaneously conduct an air war in Syria, a hybrid war in eastern Donbass, and peacekeeping operations in frozen conflicts in the Caucasus in the 2010s, not to mention propping up dictators in places like Belarus, Russia today can sustain only its land war in Ukraine. However, while that is a neat explanation, it also ignores the specifics of the relationship between Moscow and Tehran. A relationship that comes with some interesting twists. And perhaps the biggest twist is Russia's relation with Iran's greatest enemy, Israel. Now, while we wouldn't exactly call Moscow and Jerusalem friends, there's greater cooperation between the two than you might expect from Israel's nominal home in the Western camp. Israel hasn't joined sanctions on Russia, hasn't sent Ukraine advanced weapons, and back in February voted against a UN resolution condemning Moscow's invasion of its neighbor. The reasons why Israel and Russia are at least semi-friendly would fill a video in and of itself. But the key point here is that Putin is very eager to keep things cordial with the Israelis, with the upsides to a positive relationship with Jerusalem outweighing the downsides of Iran getting humiliated. Nor is Israel the only friend Russia wants to preserve in the Middle East. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia have both maintained partnerships with Moscow, with the UAE even becoming a key destination for Russian oligarchs escaping sanctions. Both countries would be far from impressed were the Kremlin to start supplying Tehran with advanced weapons. Then there's the fact that even the Kremlin might not even want Tehran acquiring the most advanced weapon of all, nukes. Assuming the ceasefire holds, the Iran-Israel war seems to have been limited in scope. Although Israel assassinated leadership figures, it didn't quite dare push for regime change, with the majority of its operations being aimed at stopping Iran's nuclear program. And that might suit the Kremlin just fine. Not just because an Iran with nukes would potentially destabilize the entire region, but because, as The Atlantic writes, quote, Moscow knows that it would lose leverage over a nuclear Iran. And it's here where we come to our final theory. Maybe Russia has failed to help Iran for the simple reason that having a weaker partner might suit Putin. Speaking to the Wall Street Journal, Tino Sandai from the Stockholm School of Economics noted that, quote, a common complaint in Iran is that China and Russia, rather than being true friends, exploit Iran's isolation to get cheap natural resources while selling Iran second-rate military hardware at inflated prices, sometimes never even delivering the promised equipment. End quote. In other words, Tehran's weakness means it can't be choosy about who it sells weapons and oil to, but also can't then do anything about it when the buyers of those weapons or oil fail to give it much in return. These then are some of the main dynamics that might explain why Moscow did effectively nothing to help its strategic partner, when crunch time came. But of course, Russia isn't the only player in the Axis of Upheaval that Tehran might have expected help from. Just as important in this so-called axis, and with far greater economic power at its disposal, is the nation of China. But as it turns out, Beijing has been just as reticent to come off the sidelines as Russia has. Iran depends heavily on China, far more so than it does on Russia, with China serving as Iran's largest trading partner and the largest importer of its oil. Since 2021, China has earmarked the equivalent of nearly $500 billion to invest in Iran, and since then, it's been the beneficiary of sharply discounted oil and consistent access to energy resources in the event of war with the West. But much like Russia, China's interests in the Middle East go much further than Iran, and in fact, China is far closer to the other Gulf nations like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, nations that have quite a negative relationship with Iran. Unlike many of China's other partners, Iran can be belligerent at times, even demanding that China pay more for oil in 2023 and then stopping the flow of oil temporarily when Beijing refused. At the same time, Chinese weapons have yet to flow into Iran in large quantities, despite the fact that China is trying to become a major exporter of modern military equipment. China supported America's first nuclear deal with Iran, the JCPOA, despite helping Iran's rivals in Riyadh develop a civil nuclear program. And when it was convenient, as recently as 2024, for China to reject Iran's claims in a territorial dispute with the Emirates, they did so unapologetically and with little regard for Iranian backlash. In the global press, China talks a big talk about what Xi Jinping referred to in 2024 as his desire to, quote, unswervingly develop friendly cooperation with Iran. But once you peek into the details, China's relationship with Iran is relatively superficial. Beijing is willing to compromise basically none of its other interests in order to make life easier for Tehran, and Beijing's leaders are fully aware that Tehran needs them more than they need Tehran. So when Iran and Israel entered a direct confrontation where Iran could have threatened to rapidly develop a nuclear weapon or shut down the Strait of Hormuz to restrict the flow of oil from the Gulf states, neither of those actions would have come with any benefit to China. In fact, they'd have brought a real risk to China's bottom line, and if China had supported Iran in its war effort, it is difficult to identify any real, tangible benefit that China could have gotten out of the whole thing. Sure, if there were a world in which Iran could hand Israel and the United States a major strategic defeat, embarrass their militaries on the world stage, and then force them into submission, then that might have been a version of the future that China would want to usher in. But in this world, the gap in military capabilities between the US and Israel on one side and Iran on the other, it was just simply too absolutely massive for Chinese assistance to make up. Unlike Russia, where the Kremlin is happy to hand out security guarantees even if it's lacking on follow-through, China has never made a habit of handing out guarantees to protect its allies. That is simply not China's modus operandi. It's a nation that has no real history of foreign intervention and no desire to take part in somebody else's regional war. So, when the war broke out between Israel and Iran, it would have been highly uncharacteristic for China to get involved, not least because the faster Iran was defeated, the sooner China could be assured that its regional oil interests were safe from harm. Instead, China has kept its support for Iran strictly rhetorical, tut-tutting and berating the United States from the sidelines, but demonstrating zero interest in actually doing anything about the situation. When the US attacked Iran directly, China accused Washington of severe violations of the UN Charter and called on the UN Security Council, where the US has veto power, to intervene. China joined Russia and Pakistan in calling for a ceasefire and condemned Israel's, quote, violation of Iran's sovereignty. In a moment when the United States and one of its closest allies can be accused of flagrantly ignoring international norms, it does serve China's interest to call that out. Beijing could sit on the sidelines and condemn warmongering Americans, imploring the rest of the world to follow China's example instead, and look to China as the picture of diplomatic restraint or even a natural peacemaker. But China's ability to serve its own domestic interests in this conflict ended there. And if there is any consistent way to effectively understand China's actions, it's by assuming that China will protect its own interests above all else. Finally, there's the fourth nation of the Axis of Upheaval, North Korea. In some ways, it's the madman of Pyongyang that would seem best suited to help the theocracy in Tehran in its time of need. Rogue state collaboration at its very finest. After all, North Korea has proved perfectly willing to help Russia during wars, sending over 10,000 troops to accomplish that very task. And if Iran wants a nuclear weapon so badly, then North Korea is the perfect candidate to provide one. Iran and North Korea are already suspected of collaborating on missile missile designs, underground bunker design, and more. So surely Pyongyang could be talked into sending a warhead. But in truth, Iran doesn't want a nuclear weapon, at least not now. Perhaps it truly is Tehran's ambition to have a nuclear arsenal one day, despite their insistence that they only want a civilian nuclear program. But Iran understands just as well as anybody else that if it built a nuclear weapon today, it would be attacked by Israel and America with far greater force than it already has been. Nor would North Korean troops be much use. After all, Israel and Iran are fighting an air war, and while North Korea does have plenty of bodies and ammunition to spare, it can't rapidly transfer medium-range ballistic missiles across the 4,000 miles between Pyongyang and Tehran. Put simply, North Korea and Iran aren't equipped for any kind of real military partnership. Their economies are in chronic disrepair, they lack the logistical means to transfer personnel or weapons at large scale, and both of them have enough problems already before seeming as if they're teaming up in an alliance that would send the Western world into a very violent panic. So there you have it. A relatively simple, clear-cut set of explanations as to why the Axis of Upheaval was missing in action these past 12 days. But while these reasons may seem straightforward, they also do point to a deeper truth. For all the talk about a multipolar world, the fact remains that the only nations capable of challenging America just aren't very good at building durable military alliances. Sure, on the economic side, groupings like the European Union or even BRICS could be said to wield might comparable to the US, but when it comes to hard power, the guns, the bombs, and the missiles of force projection, there is literally nothing on Earth that can match the network of alliances America has built across the globe. For now. Because the reason Washington remains top dog today isn't just thanks to the US operating the most powerful army in existence, it's because nations around the world can look at the way America stepped into this war to help its ally Israel, then look at the way the Axis of Upheaval ignored its friend Iran, and draw their own conclusions. And when it seems like Washington extends that same protection to allies from Poland to South Korea, well, that makes Team America seem like a pretty good side to be on, doesn't it? But in this era of fraying bonds, it is worth asking how much longer this might be true. As US commitment to NATO is called into question, as allies in East Asia are hit with tariffs and subjected to defense spending shakedowns, it suddenly seems like the American web of alliances may not be as strong as it once appeared. The Axis of Upheaval may have been humiliated by its inability to protect Iran in this war, but it may be that unless something changes soon, it's the collective West that's one day left to whistle and look the other way as one of its own members is left out to dry. Thank you for watching.